The weather from the 8th to the 10th of February was foggy and overcast, with temperatures around 0 degrees.
Dr. László Farkasházi.
Medical Lieutenant Buda, 1st District, at the Rock Hospital in Buda Castle. The hospital guard suddenly sounded the alarm, and around the entrance, the Germans, even the wounded, began a frantic clicking of heels, those who still had heels. Suddenly, a bunch of officers in dress uniform appeared, all high-ranking, led by a tall, stocky, balding, stooped SS general. The Germans, stunned, kept saying to each other that this was General Pfeffer-Wildenbruch himself, the commander-in-chief. The general looked rather pale. His face was distraught. He ran through our ward. We had only amputees, so he had to constantly dodge them, and sometimes even had to step over the wounded lying on the floor. He was hurrying frantically. His escort fidgeted behind him like a frightened flock of sheep. All of them were visibly choked by nausea from the thick, pervasive stench emanating from the wounds and the excrement and vomit of the dysentery patients. And then, in his nervousness, the general mistook the door. Instead of going to the exit, he opened one of the side doors. Dr. Becker, the chief physician of the ward, who was trudging at the end of the flock, cried out in alarm to warn him, but it was too late. General Pfeffer-Wildenbruch opened the door, opening into a small cubicle that we had previously used to store cleaning supplies, but now it was the cemetery for amputated body parts. The general stared in shock for a moment at the legs, arms, and all sorts of parts of them, already piled up to chest height, then slammed the door shut, and pulling a handkerchief from his inner pocket, found the exit. That was the last we saw of him, with the handkerchief pressed to his face, forcing back the rising vomit with a tremendous effort.
Neseu László.
15 years old. Buda, District 1, Mészáros Street 32.
Opposite us, there are already Russians on the tracks. They are shooting from under the wheels of the train. The wounded are very afraid, because supposedly the Russians shoot all SS men without exception. The Russians who voluntarily defected to the Germans are the most afraid. It's 8:30 in the morning. I'm standing at the cellar entrance. 17 Germans have just arrived to defend the house. Among them is an SS of English origin. 5 of them are standing here next to me. I'm writing in the meantime. We don't talk. They are very nervous. They smoke one cigarette after another. Their hands are trembling. They are loading their machine gun magazines. One of them is a pilot. His plane was shot down here. Now he is also defending. A large flare pistol hangs at his side. 2 of them have already asked to change into civilian clothes. They can do that upstairs. We won't let them change in the shelter. Another horse died in the house. The walls are bloody up to a man's height. Horse blood. 10 minutes past 5 o'clock. A German wounded by a mine is being bandaged in the cellar corridor. He was wounded in the thigh and on his hand. I looked at it. The blood doesn't bother me anymore. One of the shrapnel pieces tore off his fingernail from the root. The bone was also visible. He moaned very, almost unnaturally deeply. At times like this, Aunt Margaret is so pale, as if she is about to faint.
Lux Gyula.
60 years old college teacher. District 12.
On the 8th of February, we noticed that 5 female corpses were lying in the neighbouring garden. It turned out that they were machine-gunned by Soviet soldiers at night while fleeing their burning house. They wiped out almost the entire Krompecker family. Later, the wounded Krompecker also died. We experienced various forms of humiliation. Different Russian groups constantly came and went in the house, ransacking everything, the closets, trampling the remaining belongings with their muddy boots. They smashed my sculptures, scattered and trampled my photographs and color slides, and used almost every room as a toilet, while smashing our actual toilet. They kept coming to look for forced labourers. I pretended to be lame, walked with a stick, and thus somehow avoided being taken away. But the janitor was taken away, and along with about 1,500 other people, they were herded to Torbaji in terrible slush because the snow had begun to melt. Fortunately, on the third day, about 30 to 50 people were selected from this group, including the janitor, and they were sent home. The rest, however, were taken away, and many of them have not returned to this day, 11 years later. There were many women among them. They also did not return. So a dear acquaintance of mine, Mrs. Moller, who was taken away with her daughter, and no news of them ever came. And their house was set on fire, and Moller was shot dead.
Note: Dr. Karoly Moller was a well-known architect. On February 3, 1945, Soviet soldiers who broke into their house made him and his son dig their graves in their garden, then shot them into them. One of the head of the family's daughters was raped on the terrace and then shot dead. Karoly Moller's wife and other daughter were taken away and never returned.
Since the neighbouring house was evacuated by the Russians and all civilians were driven out of the house because they made room for a command post there, all the residents moved in with us, a total of 16 people. So now there were a total of 23 of us in the cellar because the janitor's apartment and the laundry room were occupied by Russians. Among the newcomers were 3 young women. As soon as it got dark, drunken soldiers came into the cellar and wanted to drag out the young women. Since we had already heard about similar cases, I asked those present to start screaming at the top of their lungs if such a Russian tried to come in and take someone away. We did so because we expected that the command post in the neighbouring house would surely be attentive to the screaming, and perhaps come to our aid. When the 2 beasts heard this terrible screaming, they thought it best to run away. And indeed, people came from the command post, and so the women were saved. We did the same in other cases, because such scenes were repeated every night. But then came night robbers as well. They locked the front door to prevent any of us from going out to ask for help, and they ransacked everything in the house and took whatever they liked. This has been going on for 10 days. One evening, a drunken capitano came and demanded that we make him tea and give him a place to sleep. However, since we had no sugar and he wanted it with sugar, he threatened us that he would search the house, and woe to us if he found sugar. Finally, we offered him coffee, which he accepted. Fortunately, a patrol came and took the drunken fellow away. 2 young men also came over to us from the neighbour's house. The Russians accused them of being soldiers and took their IDs. They wanted to take them away, but I, with my Slovak language skills, managed to make them understand that they were not soldiers, so they didn't take them away.